Imagine a world where the Bible, the cornerstone of both Judaism and Christianity, didn't exist as we know it today. This might seem inconceivable, but it's a historical truth. In the 1st century CE, the concept of a fixed, authoritative Bible was still in its formative stages. Instead, a diverse collection of texts, some revered and others less so, guided the spiritual lives of Jews and early Christians. This video delves into the fluid and evolving nature of sacred texts during this crucial period, exploring how the idea of a biblical canon gradually took shape over the following centuries. In the 1st century, both Jews and early Christians recognized a core set of texts that held significant importance. These texts included most, if not all, of what we now consider the Old Testament. However, the status and usage of these texts varied widely. For example, the Psalms were frequently cited and revered, while books like Obadiah received much less attention. The community at Qumran, known for the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even placed the book of Habakkuk in high regard, using it to interpret their own circumstances. This diversity in textual emphasis highlights the lack of a fixed, universally accepted canon. The term biblical canon, as we understand it today, did not exist in the 1st century. Instead, there was a spectrum of texts that were considered holy, ranging from those universally accepted to those that were more controversial. This fluidity allowed for a wide range of interpretations and uses. For instance, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, was highly valued by Jews, but it was not necessarily seen as more authoritative than other books like the prophets or the writings. Similarly, early Christian communities drew on a variety of texts, some of which are now considered part of the New Testament, but others that were eventually excluded. As time progressed, the paths of Jewish and Christian textual traditions began to diverge. Jews tended to move texts like the deuterocanonical books, such as Tobit and Judith, into the outside category, while Christians often embraced them, though without elevating them to the status of the core texts. This divergence reflects the different theological and communal needs of each group. By the end of the 2nd century, the concept of a fixed canon began to take shape. For Jews, this process was more organic and less formalized, with the Hebrew scriptures gradually being recognized as a coherent collection. For Christians, the process was more deliberate, with conciliar rulings and official lists emerging in the 4th century. The term canon itself, meaning a rule or standard, only began to be applied to the collection of holy books in the early Christian period. Athanasius, a prominent Christian leader in the 4th century, was one of the first to use the phrase "not of the canon" to describe certain texts. In Judaism, the Torah held a special status, often treated as the foundation document of the faith. Figures like Philo, a 1st century Jewish philosopher, wrote extensive commentaries on the Pentateuch, reflecting its central importance. However, the distinction between the Torah and other texts, like the prophets and writings, was not as pronounced as it later became. The Mishnah, a central text in Jewish law, frequently cited books from the writings, such as Proverbs, suggesting that the practical core of the Hebrew Bible was more fluid than its theoretical structure. In early Christianity, the Old Testament was often referred to as the Law and the Prophets, with a threefold description in Luke chapter 24, verses 44. The Law of Moses, the Prophets, and the Psalms. This indicates an awareness of the Torah's preeminence, but does not assign it a higher status in practice. Christian lists of Old Testament books, such as those compiled by Eusebius of Caesarea, were linear and did not emphasize the Torah's unique position. This reflects a more egalitarian approach to the sacred texts, where all were considered equally important. The Jewish organization of the scriptures into law, prophets, and writings became clear by the time of the Babylonian Talmud. However, the rationale behind this division remains somewhat mysterious. The prophets and writings contained a mix of texts from different periods, and the custom of reading a haftarah, a selection from the prophets, after the Torah reading in synagogue services, further complicated the distinction. Early Christian writers were largely unaware of this threefold division, which suggests that it was not a significant factor in their textual traditions. Christian lists of Old Testament books often placed the historical books and the Pentateuch together, followed by the poetic and wisdom books, and then the prophetic books. This arrangement, which climaxed with the prophetic texts, was likely influenced by Christianity's emphasis on prophecy. The New Testament frequently interpreted Old Testament texts as foretelling the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the placement of prophetic books at the end of the Old Testament reinforced this perspective. The 1st century CE was a time of profound transformation in the way sacred texts were understood and used. The concept of a fixed, authoritative Bible was still in its infancy, and the paths of Jewish and Christian textual traditions were diverging. The fluid and evolving nature of these texts during this period laid the groundwork for the more formalized canons that emerged in later centuries. In the end, the Bible as we know it today is the product of a long and complex historical process.